My recollection of gaming is not as clear as it may have been some years ago, but if I can't cast my mind back, I think immediately of being 6 years old, having the Hobbit read to me in school, getting involved in rewriting bits of the Hobbit, making little sketched out drawings, etc. This is all down to a teacher in the past called Mrs. McConaughey. She was the one responsible for reading that Hobbit. Hello, I'm Colin Green, and you are listening to Spike Pit. The chief reason for doing these retread remixes is so that I can put something together that is self-contained, hoping that it will stand the test of time a little bit better once it's out in the wide world. And recently, I've come up with an idea of putting things onto the Spike Pit Patreon. I put together a kind of more collaborative, self-contained episodes. Going forward, if this is something that you'd like to get involved with, I urge you to take a look. Come and join us. What is your earliest memories, perhaps, of what could have been the inspiration for your interest in the hobby, although at the time you wouldn't have realised it was the hobby?
Well, I think you were obviously a couple of years ahead of me at school, so I think similar. I had the same teacher a couple of years later. We also read The Hobbit, but by that time I think you'd probably just about started getting into Dungeons and Dragons already. I pretty much joined in at the same sort of time or in the same year at school that we were reading The Hobbit or having The Hobbit read to us. So it came in at about the same time, I believe. So yeah, I was pretty much started straight onto the Dungeons and Dragons role playing, really.
Now that would have been, by my calculation, we're talking 80, 81, and we started out, as regular listeners will be aware, we were playing Moldvay Basic, and that was what Mrs. McConaughey started us off on. And I distinctly remember our first adventure, which I talked about, where we were adventuring in a sort of nightmare version of our school. Do you recall that?
Yeah, we discussed this the other day, and I don't actually remember the adventure. I remember playing Dungeons and Dragons with her son and yourself at their house, and I do remember having to go to the toilet numerous times because of getting a bit excited and having too much to drink and being a little bit scared, I must admit, on some of the sessions. So that's my only real early memories of playing D&D.
It was definitely scary, and I remember that to actually go to the toilet in her house required a fairly extensive walk through the house in the dark upstairs. It was a business that was needed to be rushed to get back to the game and not kind of get waylaid by some sort of imaginary monsters en route.
Yeah, I remember the coming back down was a lot quicker than the going up with the lights on, because you had to turn the lights off at the top, I think.
Yeah.
So we used to come back down the stairs, back to the table, very eager, very quickly.
It was also gaming with our teacher that brought in Talisman. She had made a copy of Games Workshop's Talisman, the 1983 release. She'd kind of built a bootleg copy. Do you remember? It was a kind of photocopy cut and paste job.
Yeah, I've got some vague memories of a put together copy, as it were, but I strongly remember getting our own copy. I believe it was a Christmas present, and I think that was one of the earliest games that we really played as a family. Spent many hours playing Talisman when we was in our caravan. We used to go on our little caravan holidays, or Christmas was always a favourite time to get a new board game. So fond memories of Talisman, which went on for years and years. Many expansions, Dungeon, the City, even the Timescape or Time Lock Space.
Yeah, I think for me the best expansion for Talisman was the Adventure. Then it led into what became pretty bloated, and the setup time and the breakdown got all a bit too much. But I think as kids that didn't worry us so much. I think it's only when we revisited it in later years did the bloat seem to be an issue.
Yeah, there was too many components at the end, and the game was sort of stretched, and it sort of broke down some of the core mechanics where you could get from the dungeon straight to the Crown of Command, which was like the centre of the board, all dependent on the luck of the dice, obviously. But yeah, the whole sort of first game, or the main game, was all about slowly moving your way into the middle of the board and building up your character so you were strong enough to do it.
How much do you think the designer, Robert Harris, part of the Games Workshop team, how much do you think they drew on the success of, or what appeared to be the growing success of fantasy gaming and Dungeons and Dragons? How much do you think they drew on that for their Talisman release?
I think Dungeons and Dragons made a massive impact, and the whole role-playing scene brought that game into more people's homes, and it became more and more popular just because it was a bit like a board game version of role-playing.
It's got the ingredients, it's got a fairly rapid progression. You've got attributes that go up and down, you've got your wounds, magic items, monsters. You've kind of got a mission and an adventure, and the story kind of famously forks as you get onto the third tier, and you can go craft or strength route. So I thought that was good, and I think at the time we were talking about board gaming at Christmas, and we'd been playing the likes of Stratego and some of the MB games, Risk, stuff like that. And this was the first game where I thought we were getting our parents involved in what was our hobby. I think me being a couple of years older, maybe I felt that a little bit more because I was designing my own monsters and starting to run adventures and write dungeons and have birthday parties that were themed on D&D. So I was looking to get everything to have that D&D vibe, really.
Yeah, it was always hard to get a group for D&D. That's the problem with a lot of people for role playing, I should imagine, is getting people for a face-to-face group, because obviously there was only face-to-face groups back in that time. We were lucky we had friends at school that we managed to get into role playing, but like you said, with the board game you could have just family, friends, people that thought that role playing wasn't for them or thought it was weird or strange. They would happily sit down and roll a few dice and move a character around a board and play a board game, because it was similar to Monopoly or whatever board games, Cluedo, and what games they were used to playing. So it wasn't that big a difference to them.
So what you're talking about there is like the classic gateway or on-ramp concept. There are other games, and the first one that comes to mind for me is the classic Hero Quest. Do you recall how that came to be? I got a feeling that was your game, weren't it?
I think that was one of my Christmas presents. Once again, we had the tradition of at least one Christmas present would be a board game every year.
Yeah.
At least one of us, or both of us, and I'm sure Hero Quest was one of those. It had the classic Dungeon Master screen, so someone was setting up all the little items behind the screen with a little map, and again you had your characters moving around, leveling up, but you could flow from one game to another. You'd move on as a little team, and the wizard would get new spells, and yeah, there was a definite, again, role-playing sort of feel to it, but obviously you were limited on the board because it was a set board.
That never really seemed to matter, though. I never found that as all that limiting, and it did seem to kind of attract quite a few people. We got people involved with Hero Quest that never played any of our role-playing games. That's a fact.
Yeah, again, we'd quite happily play it with mum and dad. They would take part. We would take it in turns. Generally, it was normally you or me that took the role of the Dungeon Master or the Games Master. Everyone loved it, I think.
What about the date? Can you recall? I'm a bit sketchy as where that came in our development, on the timeline.
I would say it was mid-80s.
Yeah.
I'm thinking 85, something like that. I would say it was around that time.
I think by that time I'd started making a foray into some other Games Workshop releases like Warhammer Fantasy Battle. The board gaming at this point probably tailed off for me a little bit, although I was still playing on family occasions. I think amongst my friends we were getting into miniatures games, and that could have been to do with Hero Quest. I think it's possible that you got Hero Quest as a Christmas present because you were maybe deemed as a bit too young for Warhammer. I'm not sure. I'm not quite sure how that came to be, but there were other Games Workshop games. You remember the Doctor Who? We played quite a lot.
Yeah, we had the Doctor Who boxed game, similar box to Talisman. Again, remember many times searching the galaxy, coming across the Cybermen, and I've managed to get K9. I remember K9 being one of the most useful allies that you could have on your team. Some strange cybermat creature that looked like a woodlice.
Yeah.
I can't remember.
And the Thermal Lance.
Yeah, the Thermal Lance was a really nasty
Yeah.
weapon that you could get, and you were basically just travelling around looking for these strange keys with different sort of symbols on.
You had 3 things on each planet, didn't you? I think it was a grid with a planet in each grid with the name of the planet, if I recall, and you had like a blue counter, a red counter, a green counter and a purple counter, but I don't know if they were always present.
Now, you had some blanks, so you could turn up at somewhere, get some great sort of magical artifact type thing, and no monster whatsoever. And then the next planet across, you could come across something that you would deem as pretty useless, and come up against the Cybermen or Daleks or something that were really going to challenge you. So, yeah, it was heavily luck based on that front, but it was always exciting to see what you turned over when you turned over those counters.
And it's not a title that gets talked about very often. I don't know if it made a splash in America or just didn't happen. Obviously, it was a Games Workshop release before they were tied into exclusively Warhammer and 40k and all that. I think it had a lot of the elements that you'd find in a roleplay because it was kind of exploration. There was the equipment and the goodies. There was fighting the baddies. You almost had NPCs in the form of the assistants. So I think they definitely took some inspiration from, well, you know, the current RPG craze that was ongoing at the time. Games Workshop, they really had 2 main strands of game that they were putting out. They had stuff that drew from RPGs, and then they had stuff that drew more from some of the war game type things.
Well, they had the miniature games, didn't they? So they had board games that were more miniature based. The one I remember and still love to this day was Space Hulk. That was quite an early game once again, and I think it had a little resurgence recently where they did a sort of limited edition or a limited run of it, because you had the miniatures, you had the board that was randomly sort of laid out, or it came with a number of scenarios. So you laid out the map, and you got your little squad in your team,
and you could draw parallels between the squad and what we know as the party. They were almost an adventuring party, weren't they?
Yeah, I mean, in the Deathwing expansion, you brought in some new characters as well. So you had your grunts or your marines, which were your standard sort of fighters, I guess. You'd always have a commander or a leader who would lead the way. You'd have librarians. You'd have sort of heavy weapon guys, melee guys. So you'd have the different sort of classes more with the expansion. And it did add quite a bit to it, and you could build your team with sort of points, values and things. So it did expand on it quite a lot. But the thing I liked about it was the whole command points. So you had so many points per member of the team. So even turning, moving, shooting, they all had command point ratings, and you also got a random sort of team command point that you could spend on any of the team. Something I've always thought of when we talked about role-playing games is the whole, you can move or you can shoot. Why can't you spend your time not moving and shoot twice? Well, that's not how it works. With that game, you could do all your movement on all your command points just moving, or you could spend all your command points just shooting. You had options and it was very simple how it was laid out. I always liked that system. You knew exactly where you stood. Something I thought role-playing games could maybe use time for actions, and you've got so much time and you decide which actions you want to do rather than just move, shoot, or shoot, move.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely RPG systems that use a different action economy, and I can't think offhand, but you've definitely got games out there where you could shoot twice if you didn't move. Fairly famously, D&D is not one of those. And the other thing about Space Hulk, of course, it's got that tension idea introduced with putting a timer, real time on the game.
Yeah, it came with a little egg timer, at least a suggestion of a time limit, and they also built into the game mechanics that if you did lose your main man or your commander, your time limit would actually be reduced. So instead of having 90 seconds or 2 minutes, it may have been, it was reduced by 30 seconds if you lost your commander. So they sort of structured that into the game. If people were good enough at the game and liked the pressure of the good team, as it were, the Marines side, then they would limit you to time. Whereas the bad guys or the aliens, they didn't have that restriction.
You could work in a certain amount of role playing as well if you wanted to. You could ham it up, and there'd be people doing like bolter gun sound effects and screechy alien noises when they come around the corner, and it's, you could definitely play it with a more role playing kind of vibe.
Yeah, I mean, you got the blip counters as well.
Oh yeah,
so you didn't know what you were coming up against until you had line of sight on the blip. So it could be anything from 0 to 3 aliens just hiding round the corner.
Weren't there a sort of set of rules or guidelines for writing out your own missions and stuff, or did that come later, like fan produced?
I don't know if there was actually rules structuring it. They obviously promoted it, and when you got White Dwarfs and magazines like that, I think they produced extra sort of
they did
missions, and people wrote in with what they think would be good missions.
And if you wanted to just kill things and take their stuff type of game, it was a perfectly fine system for that. By the end of it, there was quite a bit of granularity with the options and the equipment fit outs and everything. You could go to town.
Yeah, it was simple just to have a counter base. So you said, this mission is going to have 40 counters, or it's going to be 50 aliens, or you can set limits on it. You could set turns, how many turns you've got to achieve something. You had exit points or entry points, so you could have to get from A to B, or you have to lock down the entry points where the aliens come through. It's something I've definitely thought about reintroducing to the group on a one-off basis, just for a bit of fun really, and I've got the 3D scenery for it now, so that would bring it to life a bit more as well.
We have played it in more recent years. I believe my eldest has played. I think Sonny would enjoy it. We probably should get it to the table and maybe do a short campaign. I tried the Stay Frosty rules, and the difficulty there was the lack of knowledge of tropes for the kids. It would be a lot more obvious if we was playing Space Hulk. The fact that it's 3D, you've got miniatures, I think a lot of that would be communicated through the props, as it were, rather than where I'm playing a space game, Theatre of the Mind. If the person is not really imagining the picture, you've got a problem.
Yeah, I mean, anyone that's seen Alien or Aliens or any of those franchise films, as soon as you say you're walking along a spaceship, the lighting flickering and bits of steam coming out from vents and whatever else was going on, and so you get into it quite quickly. But like you say, if you haven't lived through that era and seen those films, and
if you're 9 and your dad won't let you, that's the problem there.
Exactly. Yeah. So I think the miniatures and the layout and the map and the board and everything like that would bring it all into focus a bit more and make it easier to imagine and get into the game.
So what about Milton Bradley? They brought out Space Crusade, and my recollection of that was it weren't as strong, and it was very similar. And it had a little bit more variation on the enemies, because you had goblins and space orcs and things, but it was for the mass market. But I don't know what you think about that. It was a bit of a little bit lame, I thought.
Well, it was basically Hero Quest in space. That was pretty much how it panned out.
Well, it followed on from HeroQuest, didn't it? I think it was probably only a year or two after.
Yeah, like you say, it had the little goblins from sort of Warhammer 40k with their strange weapons. It famously had the sort of Ed 209 big machine that looked like
that
something
mech
out of RoboCop. The mech, which was always a nasty thing to come up against. A number of groups failed after meeting that chap. But it didn't quite work for me. I don't know why.
You couldn't make up the board, could you? It was like HeroQuest. You had that set board and you sort of closed off rooms and just moved doors around and stuff, I believe.
Yeah, I mean, it had doors and that, but it had a lot more open areas and wider corridors to get the Ed 209 character across the board, because it was so big it took up 4 squares. They had to make the corridors wider, the rooms bigger. We still enjoyed it, we still played it. I never purchased that one. I think one of my friends had it.
Did it work differently with the teams? I seem to recall, were you against each other? Was it more competitive or something like that?
Yeah, I think there was a competitive aspect to it. I think you had 2 or 3 players against the bad guys almost. So it was down to who could get the most points in kills of the bad guys.
It was a bit wonky. That part of it.
Yeah, it definitely doesn't have the same memories as the HeroQuest did. But again, it was enjoyable. But it was, I think it was a sort of afterthought, and they were trying to just continue the success of HeroQuest, really, because it went down so well, and it never really got to the same level, and I think it died out quite quickly. Or
looking at maybe bringing this to a close, they're the main runners for us in the early years, board game wise. Is there anything that we're forgetting, do you think?
I'm sure there was other games that we played, but most of those were what I would class as traditional board games.
Yeah, abstract strategies.
Yeah, this was more sort of had a slight role-playing theme, or miniature-based, and that's where it started. There were other games, workshop board games, like battle cards and things that we played. Yeah, they were the main ones that give me that sort of role-playing feel, or had some sort of connection to role-playing in my eyes.
Because at this point, really, our interests split and went wargaming and role-playing separately, because I think we're getting into the time when I was maybe 11 or 12, setting a group of friends up to play D&D, and then separately another group of friends, I'm doing Warhammer Fantasy Battle.
We played Warhammer Fantasy Battle quite a few times. We collected the figures. I know you painted the figures. I painted them to some sort of standard. Yeah, it was different. It was a massive amount of time to set up a game, play for half the amount of time it seemed to take to set up, and used to take over the whole bedroom floor, and we used to just get carried away with how big the armies needed to be, and I don't think we had that much success in the early years playing Warhammer. I'm not sure the rules were quite as good as they finally got to be.
No, first, second and third edition, really, we were scratching around, and we started to get White Dwarf, and I think it was really reading White Dwarf when they stopped putting in the role-playing games. They brought out Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. It didn't seem like that was in there for that long before they stopped doing D&D and their other games, and then they were more or less concentrating on their own games, and eventually they just went to 40k and Fantasy Battle, and all the role-playing games and other games were out of there.
So yeah, they definitely went away from the board game side of things.
Looking at the timeline, it probably coincided with the rise of the fighting fantasy books. I know Steve Jackson and Ian Livingstone were kind of turning their attentions to that. Games Workshop moved out of London and went to Nottingham, and they were concentrating on miniatures production because that was where the money was. That was when I think they decided probably role-playing games weren't worth their while, and we're getting into the satanic panic, its impact on, well, certainly on my role-playing, and by default yours. A good part of the problem with the role-playing was my school group got shut down by the church, well, by parents of players in my group who took their advice from the local church, and I ended up not really being able to play with those guys, and it all fell around my ears to a certain extent. Then I think we probably had a bit of a break. It blew over to a certain extent, and then you had your own band of merry men, and I'd in the meantime met up with a bunch of guys who I hung around with after school. We had a little bit of a group, and we were playing separate games, and then I think we did have a sort of I came back to playing in your group later on, didn't I?
Yeah, you joined us for at least a year or two before going off to university, which obviously put a stop to your role playing, and we carried on because obviously a couple of years after you, so yeah, I had a couple of more years of role playing with just my group from school, and then they went to university. I didn't go to university. We carried on for a little bit longer, then again it just came to a close. Everyone had sort of moved away, and the group just got split up and got smaller and smaller to the point where it just wasn't working out. People weren't able to make it, and it just phased out, and that's where it basically went on hold until a few years back.
But in the background, the wargaming carried on through, didn't it? Because we was in the wargaming club, and I'd still be playing Warhammer and stuff when I came back from uni on holiday, and we'd play battles in the holidays. So whilst we weren't doing the role playing games, we must have still been playing the Games Workshop stuff and the occasional Space Hulk, and because that Space Hulk and Blood Bowl, in fact, were two of the Games Workshop games that we would play when we were sort of saying, oh, there's not time for Warhammer, and you got the likes of Man of War and stuff like that as well.
Yeah, I think Blood Bowl was one of the earlier ones because we had the first edition of it, which again was the cardboard cutouts.
Yep, standees.
Rather than the miniatures that you got now. I think it was a third edition that we might have had, which was the one we probably played the most, and that's the one I've still sort of kept, I guess. I've still got the teams at home. I still love the game. I still think it's a good game. Would like to play that again if we get a chance, have a little campaign. But yeah, that was one game that we always used to play when we had a bit of time, because the Warhammer was just took too long, really.
And what we haven't mentioned, and people wouldn't realise, is that we had a whole room in our parents' house devoted to our gaming and painting and modelling type hobby, as it were. So we had a full 8 or 9 foot long table that was 5 foot wide. Even with everything on hand, it still took an age to set this stuff up.
Yeah, it was mainly the figures, just so many figures in their little blocks of 30, 40. With the green skins, there used to be hundreds and hundreds of figures. It weren't so much of an issue with my dwarfs when I used to get them to the table, because they'd have probably half the amount of figures, so it would take a lot less time to set them up. But yeah, just taking a turn moving hundreds of figures just used to soak up the time. So we often wouldn't finish. We'd get to a conclusion where we thought it was going to go one way or the other, and we'd bring it to an end, and that would be a whole afternoon gone. Talking
of time, this is one of the things I think is a stumbling block with me getting back into role-playing games, was this perception that had set in my mind from early on that putting together a campaign and running RPGs was somehow something I was not going to be able to do anymore. When I had finished at university and I was working, I had a girlfriend, and eventually got married, having a family. In your mind, RPGs take up a big chunk of your time, building worlds, writing adventures and stuff like that. We were playing board games because there didn't seem to be any of that. It was you buy the game, once you've learned it, you unpack it, you play it that evening, you pack it away, and that was how it went.
I still feel like that to a certain degree. Still like my board games because they are quick and easy, and they fit in an evening without any sort of delays or preparation or anything like that. I know that in the old days you used to spend a lot of time creating your worlds and your drawing your maps and doing your towns and your NPCs. A lot of that is available now. You can download this sort of information, and you can almost get a ready built setting, or you can get your maps, you can get your NPCs. A lot of it can be done for you if you want a quick setup. Your random tables. A lot of this information wasn't out there, I don't think, in the old days, or wasn't as easy to get to without the internet. So you felt like you had to do all that work yourself, and I think that's what probably put you off to a certain degree with the amount of time it took.
Yeah, the internet has definitely made a massive difference. The availability of RPG materials is just immense now. There's nothing stopping you from. You could virtually spend every waking hour downloading and reading materials and never run out. It's being produced faster than you can consume it. But the other thing is you're exposed to new ideas and new thinking, and the systems and style of play, to my mind, has changed. So this concept of the one shot and the kind of low prep rules light systems, they were not a thing in the past. That has been very influential on me, to the point where I don't need the board games in the way I thought I did.
There's a lot of people out there that play role-playing games that I think potentially don't really need to play role-playing games. They could be playing board games that have a similar sort of feel, or they get the same out of it. There's lots of board games out there that have that role-playing theme or continuation from game to game, legacy games, things like that. I think there's quite a few role players that don't really take part in the role-playing bit. They're just there to throw their spells and roll their dice and kill stuff and get the treasure, and you can do that with a lot of board games. Likewise, there's a lot of board gamers out there that are trying to get that role-playing feel from a board game, when they should really probably get back to the role-playing table and get the same experience, if not more, from the role-playing. So I think there's people in the wrong camp on both sides, probably.
Well, I think that was me. I'm definitely the latter one of those. I was playing board games looking for a role-playing game that I could fit into an evening's play without prep. You got to get into the hobby now to realise that things have moved on. The D&D I used to play is not the D&D that I now play. Obviously there's aspects of it that are still there, but my whole style of prep and running a game is just totally different. To the point where it's actually easier for me now to run a role-playing game than to learn a new board game.
Yeah, I mean, it's a different way or outlook on it, I think, because it's probably the opposite for me. Because of the way I GM or DM when I'm doing Dungeons and Dragons or whatever system it is, I feel that I need all the preparation to support me to be able to provide a good gaming experience. Whereas I find it quite easy to learn and teach board games. That's something that I tend to do more in our family and friends sort of circle. I tend to be the person that buys the board games and introduces them to the group, learns the rules and things, where it's probably the other way around for the role-playing. You're the one that buys the role-playing games and looks up the new mechanics and works out the systems and introduces them to our group. So it's obviously a slightly different way of looking at it, or just the thought process, or we both bring different things to the party in that sense, I guess.
And that, as they say, is a wrap. Big thanks goes out to you, the listener, for taking a bit of time out of your day to listen to Old Spike Pit. Take care, and I'll catch you later.